So good evening and welcome everybody to this webinar organized by KMA Research Committee in conjunction with the East African Medical Journal. We're just going to give about a minute or so that we can allow attendees to join, and then we'll get started after just a couple of minutes. Thank you. So welcome once again, everybody, to this webinar organized by KMA Research Committee in conjunction with the East African Medical Journal. My name is Dr. Kiplana CK from the KMA Research Committee. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this session, which will be tackling a very interesting and exciting topic, which is conflict of interest in clinical research. And today we have lined up some renowned research experts who will share their experiences and help us digest this topic in more detail. So to begin with, I'm not sure if we have anyone from KMA who will officially welcome us this evening. I don't know if we have Dr. Otara or Dr. Marion online. Okay, so
I think they're in a meeting with the NEC, so we could probably just get started. Sorry.
Okay. All right, no problem. Okay, so thank you very much. So without further ado, we want to get straight to the program. So our first speaker is Professor K. Butt, who is well renowned to those of us, especially in the clinical field. Professor Butt has 2 masters in internal medicine and also in clinical tropical diseases, and also a diploma in tropical medicine from the Royal College of Physicians in London. She's been teaching at the Department of Clinical Medicine and Therapeutics of the University of Nairobi since 1979, and she currently chairs the Ethics and Research Committee of KNH UON and also a member of KEMRI Ethics Committee. She's well published, and this evening she will be taking us through a presentation on conflict of interest in clinical research. We can straight away welcome Professor Butt to share your screen and make your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I would first like to correct something. I am not the current chairman of the Ethics Committee of KNH and UON, or I don't sit on the KEMRI Ethics Committee. I'm the past chairman of the National Bioethics Committee, and due to conflict of interest, I had to relinquish those 2 posts so that I could oversee the research in the whole of this country. That is an example of conflict of interest. So I had to relinquish those 2 posts so that I could chair the National Bioethics Committee. I'm the past chair of the National Bioethics Committee. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me for this important webinar, and I appreciate the time you have given to me. So I will start by first of all, defining what is conflict of interest. I have 2 definitions. One is a very broad one, which says conflict of interest arises when what is what is in a person's best interest is not in the best interest of another person or organization to which the individual owes loyalty. But when it comes down to clinical research, there are very many other definitions, but the one I have chosen is a set of conditions in which professional judgment concerning a primary interest, that is patient's welfare or validity of research, tends to be unduly influenced by a secondary interest or financial gain. So keep this definition in mind as we discuss the problem further. Sorry, I'm not able to move this. Okay. So why is ethics important in research? I don't know what kind of people are attending this meeting, but the people may have different level of understanding of ethics in research. So to revise some of the things, I am reminding people of some of the basic factors or facts about health clinical research. So human participants in research may be harmed. And we have got historical evidence of a lot of harm being done during Nazi era, where atrocious research projects were being carried out. And there was a definite conflict of interest. And to give you one example is, they were doing research on the prisoners. Here the conflict of interest was, they wanted to find out how much their own soldiers, the Nazi era, the soldiers, could bear extremes of climate. So they were putting these prisoners on slabs of ice, and the endpoint was death. So that is very atrocious research, which nobody could ever imagine that a human being could do, but it happened. So we have to protect the research participants, and that is due to those atrocities is when the Nuremberg Code of Conduct of Research came, and then Helsinki guidelines and SIOM's guidelines came up. So sometimes you want to do a research, but you need to weigh the harms and benefits. Okay, we'll come to the basic principles of ethics. So people have been wronged in many ways in the past. You must respect the person you are trying to investigate or research on. We have to obtain informed consent. Participants should be free to withdraw. Privacy is to be respected. Confidentiality must be protected. I'm going over it fast because most of you may know this. Remember this when it comes to conflict of interest. Because here, I can give you an example which we had encountered here. There was a research project going on in another town in Kenya, where the person who was consenting the participants, research participants, had no idea what he was doing. He was only telling the patients that you participate in research, you'll get so much money and you will benefit, and that's not the way to consent, So that is obtaining a consent is extremely important and the correct way of doing it. But we don't have time to go over all this because we have limited time. Then the beneficence. This is the second principle. You must maximize expected benefits and minimize the potential harms, which means when you're going to do any research on an individual, you have to weigh the risks versus benefits. If you think that the risks outweigh the benefits, then you cannot allow such a research because you can harm the individuals. And of course, the design has to be proper. Scientifically flawed research proposal is also ethically flawed, so you may not allow. Then the third principle is the principle of distributive justice. Benefits and burdens of research should be distributed fairly among all social and economic classes and ethnic and racial groups in society. So what does this all mean? If I give you examples, you will understand it better. We had a group of foreign soldiers being trained in Kenya, and a number of the soldiers were coming down with malaria. So their doctor wanted to try an insect repellent cream to see if it was going to protect the soldiers. But they wanted to try on Kenyans and not on their own soldiers. And they submitted such a proposal to Cambridge Ethics Committee. We rejected that proposal and we suggested to them that they had their own soldiers here, they could study on them. because they were going to use our Kenyans who are not going to benefit from the cream, the insect repellent cream. So why should they research on our Kenyans and they're not going to benefit? So that's just one example. Many other examples I could give, but we don't have the time. So when it comes to conflict of interest, there are very many ways in which there may be conflict of interest. If you look at the investigators, they have multiple interests that generate conflicts. Number one is the funding. And that's a very sensitive issue because what happens is when people get funding for a research project, they want to, the institution may benefit or an individual may benefit from the funded project. So when it comes to review of the proposal in the ethics committee, if your institution is going to get a lot of money through that project, you might be biased and may approve a proposal without adequate ethical consideration. And therefore, to mitigate this problem, we have a requirement that in the ethics committee of any institution, you should have a non-institutional member who will be participating in the decision making. So by that, you minimize the bias. The individual may also be having interest because these individual may be getting a lot of money in that project, and to attract that project may not reveal a lot of other information which may be relevant to the project. Then also the relations with the sponsor. There are projects where drug companies sponsors clinical trials. Obviously, they have a vested interest in the outcome of the trial, and so that there are some companies which want to own the results of the research. They want to analyze the final results. They want to keep everything to them, even the data of randomization to themselves, so, and not reveal a lot of information to the researchers. And that is that's a very selfish way of doing research, and there's a lot of conflict of interest here also. For the researcher wants to complete research expeditiously so that it can come up with publication. You know, there is publish or perish policy in most universities. So they want to produce a publication very expeditiously and advance their career. So all these generate a lot of conflict of interest. Then what happens is you have research misconduct. I hope maybe I should clarify what is research misconduct. When we say research misconduct, there may be fabrication, there may be falsification, there may be plagiarism, all right? And the plagiarism can occur in proposal writing, in performance, or reviewing of research also, and reporting of research results. What about what causes falsification? Again, there is the career to look at and the funding pressure. So what people may do, they may want to do a shoddy job and conduct a research which is not ethically sound. Okay, so fabrication is a research which has never been conducted and there is a result produced. That has happened, you know, and that's you have had the live examples very recently also. Now, over-interpretation of study findings. This is another place where there may be a lot of conflict of interest. What do we understand by over-interpretation? If you give an example, you may have, say, a diagnostic test, which is being developed by a certain laboratory. And then they find that the test may not be so efficient as they claim it to be, or they find out that the test is giving negative reports, is no use at all. So when it is a useless test, they will not publish those results, those findings. But if it's a positive result, they may publish the findings. So what happens is when somebody is doing a systematic review of such tests, then you may have a bias towards one side, to the positive side, and ignore the negative because it has never been published. So you may have a favorable result towards the favorable performance. Then sometimes you have people who downplay the harms. You know, you may have certain side effects of a drug or something, and you ignore it. Or there may be industries which have got vested interest. To give you an example, there was a study done by funded by the industries where they were looking at alcohol and energy drinks. And obviously they were downplaying the harms in this particular research, and it was funded by the research, it was the industries which were supporting this research. And that so they obviously have a conflict of interest there. Then there is the issue of finder fees, which means you find me a patient with the right kind of profile which I require for my research project, and you will be reimbursed so much money. And that is totally illegal and not allowed. But here there is also conflict of interest. So the finder will also look for inappropriate subjects to collect money himself or herself. Then you can have non-financial conflict of interest also. To give an example, the personal beliefs of a person who has already a preconceived idea that such and such a thing is going to work. And then when the results come out, they also twist the results towards their favorable belief. Recently, a few years back, we had one of the nurses in our hospital presenting a research proposal to the ethics committee, where she was convinced that vitamin B works on bacterial vaginosis, you know. She was so strongly believing in that she could not accept that we were not approving her proposal. Until we had to call her face to face, and she still could not believe that it was not happening. So these things can happen. And when you want to have a favorable result, you would be biased. You ignore a little differences. Then there will be conflict of interest at the level of the ethics committee members. The ethics committee members themselves may have relations with the industries which are sponsoring a particular project. And that has happened in many countries. Fortunately, here we don't have so much relations with the industries, but in other countries they do have. Or the ethics committee member may have relations with the investigator. Maybe that investigator is from your department, or from your, or is a close friend of yours, or you're working together in another place. And if that is so, that is conflict of interest, because you will be biased when you are making judgment on the research proposal. Or you could be a member of the ethics committee, or the chair of the ethics committee, and you have your own research proposal. And what would you do in that case? So we have had such problems encountered. But when you have such a conflict of interest, you can get over it by, you can get over it by disclosure of your interests, all right? And what you do is, when you are closely associated with that project, you withdraw yourself from the situation. That means you walk out of the ethics committee when they're making a decision on your proposal, if you're a member of the ethics committee. It happened to me myself. I was a principal investigator in a study, in a clinical trial. And so I had to to walk out of the meeting, and it was a minuted also, which was good, because when the auditing of my project came, they were very impressed that we were following everything to the point. But the Ethics Committee of Kenya International Hospital, KEMRI, they're both very old committees and excellent, very independent. They don't listen to others. They don't even listen to the institutional heads. They make their own decisions. They're independent committees. So that's the advantage of having independent committees. So there's disclosure, there's recusal, which you must follow. Now, we can, just one more thing before I close by the last slide. We have had incidences in this country. I need to alert people so that we know what's happening here also. We have had substandard research. We have had unethical research, not because the ethics committees have flawed, but because people have not followed the ethical principles. I give you one example where there was a children, I think it's still there, the children's home. The owner of the home was the guardian of the children. He was the member, he was the chair of the ethics committee of that home. And he was a principal investigator in a study. Now, because of funding and all that, they had to develop a proposal which was probably not properly done, but there was a whistleblower who came to us because we were mandated to oversee the situation in the whole country. And we found that that's exactly what was happening, and we had to stop that research. It was approved and everything was done, but it was stopped. We have had many incidences like that. People have done things which they should not be doing. So a good research proposal is supposed to be scientifically sound and ethically sound. Any credible journal will never publish your research if you don't have sound ethics and sound science. So my last slide. Research during pandemic. This is a very interesting issue, and we have got those two cases we are going to discuss. But in all cases, remember, protection of the human subjects is extremely important, all right? And you have to follow the internationally accepted ethical standards. You cannot get away without meeting the proper ethical standards. They must be met. However, we can adapt some of the standards to particular circumstances and contexts, but still keeping in mind the safety of the research participant. But there is equal moral respect for participants and affected communities, which means research has to be carried out because communities have to benefit, but at the same time, the research participants have to be protected also. So the question is, can research methodologies be adapted in emergencies? Yes, but we can discuss further how much and what aspects. What are the requirements for informed consent in emergencies? Again, that can be discussed. Thank you very much for listening to me. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Bhatt. That was an excellent introduction to the topic of the day. And I think we'll take the questions at the end, and I'll just remind the audience that you're free to use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions for Professor Bhatt as well as the rest of the presenters. So I'll go straight away to introduce the next presenter. We're going to have two presenters who will give us cases just to make it a little bit more realistic in terms of connecting what Professor Bhatt was introducing us to and giving us real-life examples of what has happened in terms of conflict of interest in the research world. So our next presenter is Professor Walter Jaoko, again renowned by many of us. He's a professor of medical microbiology and tropical medicine and the director of Kavi Institute for Clinical Research at the University of Nairobi, as well as extraordinary professor of medicine at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He's also an adjunct professor at the School of Public Health, University of Alabama. He has published over 200 articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals and has a keen interest in health research ethics, for which he has received grants from Canadian Center for Global Health Research and European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, EDCTP, and is currently a member of the Research Ethics Committee of Strathmore University. Professor Joko, you're welcome to make your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very, very much for this opportunity to share with you something on conflict of interest. And thanks, Professor Bat, who was my teacher of ethics. And so I'll just build on what she has already talked about. So he's mentioned that the pandemic, epidemic situations also bring some unique circumstances on their own. And if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, it has resulted in the shift of in the way scientific articles are reviewed and published. So there is an urgency to get results very quickly so that you can use the results on implementation of interventions against COVID-19. So this quick turnover has raised some concern. And the concerns have been possibilities of errors and also possibilities of malpractice because of the pressure to try and produce results. To give you an example, the New England Journal of Medicine currently receives about 40 COVID-19 related articles in one day. The JAMA have reported that they receive up to 235 COVID-19 manuscripts in a day. So you can imagine the pressure under which journals are now going. This has not increased the number of reviewers, so they have become overwhelmed with the sheer numbers. Not only are they dealing with large numbers of articles to review, the expectation also is that they have a quick turnaround just because of the fact that the results are required quickly to be used for implementation. So it has become impossible, therefore, to do thorough review that is normally required of scientific articles. What has happened, therefore, is that some things have then not turned out well and has resulted in retraction of articles. And this is an example of the story of hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine with regard to treatment of COVID-19 in a multinational registry analysis. No, so as by 31st of July, remember COVID just emerged in December 2019. 6 months later, by the end of July, 19 articles and 14 preprints had been retracted just because of these issues of the fastness in which articles are being reviewed. Probably this is the largest number of retracted articles in medical publishing, in the history of medical publishing. To retract 19 articles and 14 reprints, preprints in a period of 6 months. And there are many reasons for these retractions. Falsification is just one of those, which is research misconduct. There are people who have not used methods that are, are necessary. So there have been method errors. There have been issues of authorship, privacy, and conflict of interest. Now, for today, we will be focusing on conflict of interest in medical research and publishing. Now, this, in a study of a period of from January 2015 to December 2020, a period of 5 years, conflict of interest accounted to 1% of the articles that were retracted. Now, this looks like a small proportion, but it is still a serious academic misconduct. The problem with conflict of interest that is not declared can result in biases, it can result in low quality of research, and it can also result in loss of public goodwill. Now, conflict of interest in publishing can be defined as anything that interferes with or can reasonably be perceived to interfere with the full and objective presentation, peer review, editor decision-making, or publication of research articles that have been submitted for publication to a journal. So it is a wide spectrum from presentation. It involves the researchers, it involves the reviewers, the peer reviewers, it involves the journals themselves, including the editor decisions. Now, the causes of conflict of interest have already been mentioned by Professor Bat, but the guidelines on good publication practice, the Committee on Publication Ethics states it this way, that conflicts of interest arise when authors, reviewers, or editors have interests that are not fully apparent and that may influence their judgment on what is published. So anything that will influence your judgment in publishing as an author or as a reviewer or as an editor is construed to be a conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest by the authors and researchers have already been mentioned. So it can be financial. Sponsor may pay researchers or immediate family members. It may also be, the payment can influence an individual's thinking and even affect the outcome. But as Professor Bat has mentioned, it can also be non-financial, like the issues of publish or perish philosophy, where there is so much pressure for you to do that in order to get a promotion or to be recognized scientifically, or it could also just be sheer peer competition. There could also be relational, like Professor Bat has mentioned. Maybe your spouse has presented an article for publication, you're the editor, or your sibling, or a child, or you are an editor, but you also supervise seeker students. So those are relational, non-financial conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest for reviewers includes all the things that we've talked about, but there could also be professional rivalries among individuals working in the same specialization. So I could be sent an article to review as to the quality of the article for publication, but the article is developed by somebody probably in the same department with or in the same area where we are competing for promotion. And that would then create some conflict of interest. And there are people who want to step on everybody else, like the cartoon they're showing. Anybody who would be seen to be rivaling me, I would want to put them down. So that is an area of conflict of interest for reviewers. Now, an example of conflict of interest, and this is why I'm here this evening, was shared as a case number 1. And in this case, there's an article that was published on transmission of 2019 COVID virus infection from asymptomatic contact in Germany. And this was published by a researcher called Roth, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2020. And to show you the urgency with which COVID articles are being published, this was written, edited, vetted, and published within 48 hours. So the reason behind this is that at that time, there was considerable interest in asymptomatic transmission. So this is a new disease. We didn't know whether if you are asymptomatic, you can transmit the infection or not. And so there was a lot of interest. And that would help with making a public health decision, because if you're asymptomatic and you're able to transmit the infection, the measures would be much more stricter than if it was only being transmitted by people asymptomatic. Now, in this article, the contact case, the indexed case had a contact with somebody who on 28th of January, and yet the article was published on 30th of January. So these are people describing a situation where somebody with COVID, but asymptomatic, transmits COVID to somebody on 28th, and the article is published on 30th. Within 48 hours, the article had been published. But then people raised some concerns. So when on inquiry later, it was found that the index case actually had some symptoms. And although this was corrected to indicate that the patient had some symptoms, the article had already been published. Now, how do you address conflict of interest? I'll be ending soon. One is to just declare conflict of interest when submitting an article for publication. And this is critical for maintaining integrity in research. And remember that even if an article has already been published and a non-revealed conflict of interest is discovered later, it can lead to retraction of the article. For the financial conflict of interest, like grants, patents, stocks owned, etc., you need to disclose that. The non-financial ones, like relationships of affiliations or personal convictions or beliefs, if it has any linking to the way the article is written, you need to declare that in advance. So for example, if I'm a pro-choice person and I'm reviewing an article on abortion, I need to declare that I'm a pro-choice so that people can know that there's a potential that I might be biased in the review. The other thing is to just have publication ethics training. Researchers, reviewers, editors of journals should have ethics training on publication so that they can be able to know how to identify conflict of interest. And finally, it's just that the institutions should have conflict of interest policies that will be able to guide their employees. I will end there by just thanking you for your attention and always remembering our healthcare workers who are working during this COVID pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jauko, for that excellent build up on to where we started and especially sharing that interesting case. I think we're now down to our last presentation before we go into the Q&A session. So our next presenter is Dr. Nchafatso Bonyo. He's currently the chair of the KMA Ethics Research Committee. Sorry, not Ethics Committee, but KMA Research Committee. He's a medical doctor, well-published clinical researcher with over 10 years work experience in clinical medicine and research. He's currently working as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Critical Care Research Group in the Prince Charles Hospital in Brisbane, Australia, in conjunction with the KEMRI Wellcome Trust Research Program in Kilifi. So without further ado, Dr. Bonyo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sige, for that introduction. And also thanks very much to both Professor Butt and Professor Jauko for those interesting talks. These were both my teachers at the university. So I'll be talking about very briefly about a case of COVID-19 testing, talking about the Seattle flu study. I'm doing this not as a choice person, but this was supposed to be done by someone called Mr. Kebene, who's the head of the Scientific Ethics and Research Committee at KEMRI. But for reasons beyond his control, he couldn't join us this evening. So I'll just quickly give a background to the case, and then we'll proceed to discuss it. Before we go into this, I don't know if anyone recognizes this fellow. I think the world just came to a standstill because we didn't listen to this 34-year-old ophthalmologist from Wuhan when he just identified cases of atypical pneumonia and raised questions, but no one really listened to him. This is Dr. Wenliang, Li Wenliang, the whistleblower who died, unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic. So onto the case, I'll just give a background. This is about Dr. Chu and her colleagues, an infectious disease expert in Seattle, was collecting nasal swabs for the Seattle flu study and had developed a system of monitoring within the local area in Seattle where they were doing this. In January of 2020, when the first confirmed case of COVID-19 was announced in the area, there are critical questions that needed to be answered. Had this case been, had they infected anyone else? Was the deadly virus already spreading within the community? And to repurpose the tests for monitoring COVID, they just needed support from the state and federal officials. But nearly everywhere Dr. Helen Chu and her colleagues turned, the officials repeatedly rejected the idea. Remember, they were collecting nasal swabs for flu study. So they said it would be very easy for us to repurpose what we are doing to test for COVID, but the officials rejected this. A month later, by February 25th, Dr. Chu and her colleagues said, no, we can't bear this and we can't wait any longer. So they began performing coronavirus tests without government approval. What came back confirmed their worst fears. They quickly had a positive case from a local teenager who didn't have any history of travel within Seattle or from overseas. Then this meant that coronavirus had already established itself in Seattle and the US without anybody realizing it. In fact, officials would later discover through testing that the virus had already contributed to the death of 2 people, and which would go on to kill 20 more people in the Seattle region over the following couple of days. So the issues to discuss here about conflict of interest were federal and state officials. They said that this could not be repurposed. The flu study, nasal swabs they were taking could not be repurposed because Dr. Chu and her colleagues did not have explicit permission from the research subjects from whom the samples had been taken, and the labs were also not certified for doing COVID-related work. But while acknowledging the ethical questions, Dr. Chu and her colleagues argued that there should be more flexibility in an emergency. Otherwise, lots of lives could be lost. Like I said, I'm not the expert in research ethics that was invited to discuss this case. So I've just presented the case as was, and there's a link down there for further discussion, for further reading for anyone who is interested. There's a lot of senior colleagues in the audience. I noticed the presence of Dr. John Masasabi, Dr. Hamaluba, who is the head of clinical trials at the Kemri Wellcome Trust, and Dr. Samakech, as well as Prof. Jaoko and Prof. Bat, who I'll invite to give their reflections on this case. Before I do so, I think I agree that there needs to be more flexibility during such emergency situations. And it's not like Dr. Chu and her colleagues had not tried to seek redress before deciding to just do what they ended up doing. The other important thing is we don't want to open a can of worms and say our researchers can just keep doing as long as it's for public good. Remember, at the time they were testing this, COVID had not yet been declared to be a pandemic, because they did this in February and the WHO pronounced COVID to be a pandemic in March. So I think there needs to be a lot more flexibility, and I want to hand this back to Dr. Sigei and we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obonyo, for that very interesting case as well, and also to appreciate that you're joining us all the way from Australia when it's well into almost 3 a.m. So thank you for your dedication to do that. Really appreciate. So I think we can go straight into the questions. And I think there's already one in the Q&A tab. So this is coming from Silas Lodeke. So he's a PhD student at JKUAT Kemri, currently publishing papers at EAMJ. So his question is that it's taking time for peer review of papers. What modalities can you derive so that we can get review done earlier? So maybe not directly linked to today's topic, but I think maybe because it's linked to EAMJ, perhaps we can get a response on that so that we can feel a bit at ease. So
I could probably say something before getting Mariam to speak, who's the editor at EAMJ. I think that it's an important question that Dr. Silas is raising, and just having listened to the presentations that you don't want papers that get published and retracted because of inadequate scientific rigor. There is normally pressure on the reviewers at EAMJ as well to get the right people to review the subject material. And remember, this is work that is done on voluntary basis largely. So there are also competing interests. So it's a problem, Dr. Silas, that I think the board at EAMJ, led by Professor Okeo, and the acting editor-in-chief of the journal, Dr. Yonga, well aware of, and they're trying to work around. I don't know, Mariam, if there's anything that you want to add that I may not be aware of.
Thank you, Doc, for that. Yeah, it's true, like you said, we have been having challenges, but that one has been worked on. And I understand Silas, I talked to him, and I've already mentioned that to the reviewer. I've done a follow-up with the reviewer involved, and he'll soon be getting our feedback. Back to you, Doc.
Okay. Thank you very much, Miriam, for that, and also Dr. Obonyo for responding to that. I think maybe I can also, as we wait for more questions to come in, I don't know if Prof. Bat and Prof. Jauko want to give their reaction to the Seattle case that Dr. Obonyo just shared. I don't know if you have any thoughts, and maybe even sharing some local insights on that type of conflict of interest.
Can I say something, Professor Bhatt?
Yes, go ahead, Prof.
That's an interesting case, but it's half-half, you know. We don't know what the ethics committee's comments were regarding the research proposal. Did she make a proper research proposal regarding the study she wanted to carry out on the archived samples? Number two, there is a way of doing a test on archived samples. You do it by delinking the samples so that you can study and you can find out if there are any cases of COVID-19 in that group of samples, you know. You will, without identifying who actually was the positive case. So you'll have some idea if the virus is in the community. And what is important is to know if it is there in the community. It is true you cannot reveal the identity of the research subjects without proper consent, but it's not difficult to reconsent in their situation. You know, they have got their own phone, they're easy access, not like us. Even here we can easily reconsent when we have, because of the mobile context and all that. So she could have done the reconsenting during the time she wasted trying to get the ethical approval, you see. So we have not heard the story from the ethics side. It's only the researcher side we are hearing. So that is my comment regarding that. It is true that we don't, because otherwise what will happen is under the disguise of emergency, people may do all kinds of research, even genetic research on the archived samples, and patients have a right. They can refuse. I don't want to do that. Okay, but there are certain things which we can expedite on. You know, the review can be done expedited. You know, the research proposal, you can do it fast review. You can even when it comes to consenting process. You can start with the verbal consent followed by the written consent, you know, but you know, people then again they misuse that liberty of verbal consent. You know, they'll say verbal consent done, you know, and then we never know that it was done. So that's why we insist on a written consent in our setup here. And it was still doable to me, you know, at some part of it, you know, but we have not seen her proposal and we have not seen the ethics committee report, so we don't know what exactly was the real story, because any reasonable ethics committee would not make unreasonable decisions. You know, if it was possible to do the study, they would have definitely approved, but there must be something which we don't know, you know, in that proposal. So I don't know what Dr. Jauko has to say, Professor Jauko.
Yeah, thank you. So I found this also quite interesting. I also, like you, Prof, I don't have the details because on the surface, if you read this story, you almost wonder why an ethics committee would not approve it, because here some people studying already they've collected the samples for influenza, and all they want to do is to use the samples to test for the presence of COVID. So one, there is no risk to the study participants already in terms of you're not getting additional samples. You only want trying to repurpose the technology the test that you're doing so that you can see whether there is COVID or no COVID. So on the surface, you'd wonder why they were not being allowed. And when you read this even more, it seems like, the story is that, they kept looking for this approval and they were not getting it. So you wonder, what is the reason behind it? What comments were being put on the request? Because they've already collected the nasal swabs. So like Professor Bat, I would be actually interested in knowing more details as to the reasons that the ethics committees were giving.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prof. Bat and Prof. Jack. I don't know if Obonyo, you want to add to that?
Yeah, probably I can just make a comment. It's actually an actively ongoing case at the moment in the US, where the researchers are defending themselves and saying, look, we did this, but we had tried to get approval. We had contacted all the relevant authorities. So it's still evolving, and it's going to be very interesting to see what decision will be made on this case. And like the profs have said, it would be really good also to have get insights from what the ethics committee and comments were. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think there are already two questions related to this case. Maybe I'll start with the second one. I don't know if Obonyo, you're aware if the participants were informed of future research on the use of biobank specimen. I know we sometimes take a broad consent that will allow for future research. Or might you have any idea if this was done?
For this particular case, in the flu study, I'm not sure, but I know generally when we're doing research, we normally just take, like what you said, broad sort of consent and tell participants that samples might be biobanked for future use, and participants are at liberty to say no to that bit and just say no, use my samples only for this particular study you're doing. So everything is usually just above board, and the participants are allowed to make that call on what they want their samples to be used for. I think Professor Bat has something to say, but I also want to just see if Dr. Hamaluba Mainga, who heads the clinical trials unit in KEMRI, also has anything to say in response to that. Thank you.
So who is going to be the first speaker?
Go ahead, Prof.
Okay, so this case, they had not taken any permission for any future studies, from what I understand. That's why I was talking of reconsenting. I think I'm clear about that. I read part of it, yeah. So that's my comment, yeah.
Just a comment as well, in addition to that, what I found interesting about this case, it says that they needed the support of state and federal officials. They wanted to repurpose the test for monitoring coronavirus, but they needed the support of state and federal officials. I was really wondering, and Dr. Obonyo, you're saying that the case is already in court. I'm really wondering who they are against. Is it the ethics committee, or they're against the case is against being prosecuted by the state and the federal officials?
I think it's a state that's taken the researchers to the court.
Okay, so was this presented to an ethics review committee, and do you know whether the procedure here was to take it first, to get state and federal approval first before taking to the ethics committee? Because reading the brief here, there is no mention of an ethics review committee. So I just wondered.
So that bit is also not clear, just from the bits of the case that we have had access to. And it would be good to have that information. Yeah.
But it looks like they had approached the ethics committee. I don't know whether they had a proper proposal and they were rejected. That's why she conducted the research without ethical approval. I think that is why the state is taking her to the court. That's what I think, And this is, we have examples here. You remember ozone therapy in Kenya for HIV? You know how they were doing the research without any approval in a little house in somewhere in Karen. It is things have happened. That's why people are very cautious. You cannot just allow them to do anything. But if it was very straightforward, I don't think the ethics committee would have rejected the proposal if there was a properly written proposal. As Dr. Jacos is no more than minimal risk study. Plus, even when there was another example of this colorectal carcinoma study in UK, where they wanted to reconsent the patients, and some of them they could not contact, and those who reconsented were only about less than 1% who refused to give permission. So generally, most people do give the consent, so it's not a big issue, so there must be something which we don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think, in fact, one of the questions asked by Dr. Mogeni, I think, are asking if during emergency situations such as this, should we have a special ethics committee for that period? I think, Prof, you might have alluded to that in your presentation when you said special circumstances can allow people to not completely, for lack of a better word, bend the rules, but repurpose the rules for that particular situation.
You can adapt,
Yeah,
you can
adapt.
Some specialists, and when it's a new disease like COVID, which we don't know, so you do co-opt some infectious disease specialists, but they will also not have, they'll have limited knowledge. But we have to do with that limited knowledge and do the best out of it. We may not have even a full ethics committee meeting. We can have a smaller committee meeting to expedite the process, depending on the individual proposal. But when it comes to clinical studies, using a drug, you have to be very careful. Or doing vaccine studies. There you need to have proper ethical review, because you can run into a lot of problems, because these are projects which are high-risk projects. We don't know, we are trying the drugs for the first time. And you see how many papers of chloroquine have been, retracted. What misinformation we got on chloroquine, including people's own beliefs, like even the US president himself, like he influenced the people to take chloroquine, So things like that can happen with misinformation, you see. So we have to be very, very, very careful when it comes to clinical trials,
Yeah, I agree. And I think Dr. Hamaluba, Prof, you wanted to say something, I think, on this.
Hi, yeah, I was invited to speak by Dr. Bonyo, but I think a lot of what I have to say has really been captured already. In the midst of a pandemic, there's a lot of pressure on researchers to find answers and understand disease. But I think we really risk undermining all the framework and structures if we don't follow due process. And without having the complete knowledge of the intricacies of the case, all the comments made by Professor Butt and Professor Jalko, what I would say is that, they are frameworks for expedited review. They are frameworks to engage with appropriate committees to ensure that when procedures are done and consent and research is required, it can be done in an expedited way. And we've seen this throughout the pandemic. So I think ultimately it's just really, it's a very fragile time when we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we need to be able to continue to instill confidence within just with participants, but also with the broader public. So following the process and engaging when we don't get perhaps the answers we want to hear within the frameworks of what's acceptable is really important. So yeah, that's really what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's very clear, and I think the question by Dr. Lotodo, Teresa, using archive diagnostic pathology blocks for retrospective studies, I think that was probably partially addressed also as we were delving into this case. I think as long as there's consent, could have been taken before as a broad consent, or might have to reconsent. I think that should be, the case. I don't know if we want to add anything to that. And then in terms of lessons learned, I think there are so many lessons here. You can see you might end up in court even for, going through a process that was not validated by an ethics review committee. So I think, that is pretty much a key lesson, loss of trust in the public, which we've seen a lot of that with COVID. People said, do use this drug, don't do this. loss of public, loss of quality research in terms of validating the process. I think, Prof, you want to add something, Prof. Jauko?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something, lest we leave here with an impression that if you get a broad consent, then you don't need to get ethical approval. A broad consent is actually the way forward. It is very important for researchers when you're considering a study to be able to get broad consents from your study participants. But even with a broad consent in this situation, even if these participants in the flu study had given broad consent, they still needed an ethical approval from the ethics committee.
Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And I think that's very clear. And, obviously in this particular case, the ethics review process is not clear why, it didn't go through. I don't know if we have any final questions. I think we've answered most of them and we're trying to manage the time.
There's one from Tanzania on the archive blocks of pathology specimens.
Yes, I think you want to comment on that?
Yeah, you can do retrospective studies on any of the archived specimens provided they are delinked, and if you can do without ethical not ethical approval, but without consent. But if you are going to link them, then you need consent. You can go and reconsent the individuals. But otherwise, by delinking, you can use any of the archived specimens, whether it is pathological specimen or a tissue specimen, whatever,
Okay, thanks so much, Prof. Bat, for that. And I think there's one more question that just came in which situations can ethics committee grant waiver of consent? Profs, either of the profs, do you want to comment, even Dr. Obonyo?
Waiver of consent is used on very, very few cases. First of all, it has to be no more than minimal risk for the study. And then the researchers have to give a justification as to why they don't want consent to be given. And I can give an example of an observational study or a qualitative study. So for example, if I want to do a study on seeing the behavior of nurses in a ward as to whether they wash their hands after treating every patient in the ward, because we want to see a good infection disease control measures. And I want to see whether that is being done. And I want to compare two wards where people wash their hands, or, I want to compare two populations where nurses wash their hands. If the prevalence of the nurses who wash their hands after every patient, the incidence of infection in that ward is lower than where people do not wash hands. I would be able, if I was to consent the nurses, then all of them will wash their hands. So I would have to, if my study design is such that it is minimal risk and that I will not be able to answer my research questions if the research participants give their consent, then the ethics committee would be able to waive the consent.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
I was thinking of an example what to give, So that's
Perfect example.
Perfect example.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Prof. That one actually is brilliant. So I think
generally speaking, we don't allow waiver of consent in our setup. We don't also allow verbal consenting here, although it is allowed. It's where we don't allow here because people can misuse it because of the kind of population we have, and the level of education in some areas, you see. So we insist on a written consent, and the waiver of consent is almost like Prof. Jauko said, very rare, extremely rare.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot, Prof. I know we've gone slightly over time, but I'll just indulge the audience a little bit. They're very interesting topic, and a question has just come in from Duba Doyo, who's studying in a Chinese university. And he's asking if approval from his university ethics committee suffice for research in Kenya, potentially involving participants in Kenya. I would imagine you would still need to go through a local process in Kenya, but Prof or anyone else might want to comment on that.
I must answer that question because we have had such licenses, you know.
Yeah.
We have had people coming with approval from other units, but we have to have approval from our own institution. It's not only that, they're going to do study in another institution. Maybe they will also require their institutional review body to look at your research proposal. But generally, we have an understanding between like KEMRI and KNH, you know, we respect each other's decision, but still we look at each other's proposals, you know. But people can misuse that, you know, if you're allowed to do, they will get consent for any research from their country because they're going to do it on so-called developing countries and less educated people. So they think they can do anything, you know. So they may come up with all kinds of research proposals. We had a research proposal, I give you a live example, of somebody who wanted to do lung aspiration in children to diagnose the etiology of the pneumonia. Now there is a definite risk. Death is the risk which is most severe in these people, you know. And we don't do this as a routine procedure. So we said we cannot allow this in our country. We said you can do it in your country, you know. Said, but your children are dying like flies with pneumonia. I said, yes, they're dying, but they'll die even more with your research, you know. So we don't approve such proposal. We have to look at it in our country also. Somebody wanted to do genetic studies on our athletes, you know. So we also were a bit careful, you know, the genetic studies are tricky, you know, because we don't want any genetic engineering done on our athletes, you know. So there are some studies which we don't allow, you know. That's why it's very important we approve in our own ethics committees. Yeah, actually, just to add to that, and I know we're out of time, but I work in diagnostic industry, and we do have a study that was approved at global level. Just an observational study, but we took it through the local NACOSTI and ethics review in Kenya before starting data collection. So I think this is something you cannot overlook, regardless of the type of study. It might be fast, it might be expedited faster on the nature, and it might get waivers, but still needs to go through a process. I think in the interest of time, I'll apologize if we have not answered any question or seen any comment. We'd like to bring this to a close because we like to keep it within.
Sorry, can I just answer? So just one.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
That's something very, very important, and it's a clarification that we need. He's asking why, he or she is asking why NACOSTI needs to approve a study. And I need to correct that. NACOSTI is the body that is mandated by law to regulate ethical research in Kenya. But they have then accredited research ethics committees that reviews the proposals on their behalf. So what you get, once an ethics review committee approves it, like in this case, they're talking about MTRH, once they approve a study, that study has a NACOSTI approval because they're doing it on behalf of NACOSTI. What you then need, if you're going to the community, there is something we should not confuse with. It's called a permit, a research permit. And that one you need if your research is not going to be confined within your institution and you're going to the community. So that is something different. I just thought that was important. Thank you. Apologies for that.
Yeah, no, I will also, I used to chair the NACOSTI ethics committee, So the function of that committee is mainly to oversee the functioning of all the ethics committees and accreditation of the countrywide ethics committees, and also dispute resolution. Those are the key functions of and like Professor Jauko says, it is just gives a permit for the rest.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. Indeed, a very important question. And for sure, this discussion cannot end in just this one webinar. As KMA Research Committee, in conjunction with partners, we are keen to have future webinars to look not just at this topic, but any other research topics. So we'd like to request that we continue perhaps in a future forum. But also, if you have a very burning question, you can email the team at KMA Research Committee and EAMJ, and we'll actually forward them to the presenters today who can then respond on that. I think at this point, I want to first of all thank everybody for their attention up to this point. I'd like to invite Dr. Amazottara, the Vice President of Kenya Medical Association. I see he's online. I'd like to request him to bring the meeting to a close. Dr. Ottara, you have the floor.
Hello. Thank you, Chairman, for inviting me. I'm sorry I came in late. I was supposed to have started off the meeting, but I'm glad I joined when Professor Butt had just started. So I just want really to thank the presenters, my teachers, Professor Butt, Professor Jaoko, and our own council member, Dr. Obonyo, for very good presentations, very concise, very brief, but still very informative sessions we've had. And particularly at this time of emergencies, I think there's a lot that has come out that is positive for us in terms of medical research and publications, issues of conflict of interests, issues of falsification of data and mispresentation of facts. And yes, for us as Kenya Medical Association, we are keen on ensuring that our journal, the EAMJ, is out and running. So we encourage more people to present. And this is one of the events, one way of trying to improve the quality of our papers. And besides that, we've learned today that, yeah, corruption is not just out there among the politicians, but we can also have corruption in our profession. So through the Ethics and Research Committee, we at KMA, we are coming up with a code of conduct, and I'm sure we will have a lot of input from your membership. And yeah, as a profession, we need to be high up there, not just in clinical practice, but also in research and publications. So I'm really glad for the two committees for putting this together. We appreciate KEMRI, and we pray that we continue having this association that can improve our outputs as providers, as researchers, yeah, for the good of humanity. Thank you so much, Dr. Sige, and all that have participated, all our guests from all corners. Asante sana.
Thank you very much, Dr. Otara. And I think at this point, as I can bring the meeting to a close, I do know that it is CPD accredited. I think that was a question I saw on the chat, and I think KMA will support that for those who require CPD points. Just a reminder to everyone, this is part of a series of webinars that we've been holding as KMA Research Committee in conjunction with EAMJ. And it happens on the second Wednesday of every month. And so the next one will be on the 10th of November. So stay tuned for more information via email regarding the topic for that particular webinar. So at this point, thank you very much to everyone for your attention. We apologize, we had to run slightly over time, but I think the topic indulged us quite well. So I hope that we are all now a little bit better off than we came regarding this topic of conflict of interest. And with those remarks, I'll bring the meeting to a close and thank everyone and wish you all a good night.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.